I'm Donald Trump, and I will make the circus great again.
No, you will not. Under you, the top 1% of clowns have more wigs than the bottom 90%. This must change. Back me up, Joe.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Biden, and, no malarkey here, everyone. Welcome to Politicians Are Clowns, where we do economic analyses of the goofy, ridiculous, and oftentimes quite scary policies our elected leaders enact. Today we're going to be talking about Mayor Ted Wheeler, the Democrat of Portland, Oregon, because recently he's announced that he's going to move out of his nice apartment in downtown Portland in favor of something more in the suburbs. And the reason he's doing that might be what CNN might dub fiery but mostly peaceful protests. Fires, arson, looting, fireworks, vandalism, all in all ruining people's lives with the destruction that's going on. Here, protesters are in front of the mayor's apartment complex and throwing flaming things into the apartment, trying to burn the building down. How nice of them. All in all, it's been pretty bad. This graphic, courtesy of the Portland Police Department, details the riots by day from May 29th through August 19th, although as of the making of this video, the protests are still going on. All of the white icons represent something very nasty, violent, and illegal that the protesters have done. They're fires set, projectiles thrown, vandalism, riots declared, and fireworks. And as you can see, there are a lot of them. It's been pretty bad. And what has the mayor done about it? Well, the mayor has wanted to disband the gun violence reduction team as a Trump supporter was shot in his city. He wants to defund the police in solidarity with his Black Lives Matter supporters as his city burns to the ground, and he has refused Trump's help as Trump has offered to send in the federal troops in order to quell the riots, while a number of 911 calls have gone unanswered because the police are too busy dealing with the riots that are ongoing. As you may have already guessed, I myself am very much opposed to these riots and believe that society should do what it can using law enforcement to restore law and order not only to Portland but to all cities across the US which are still being affected by the lawlessness. Others, such as some affiliated with the Black Lives Matter movement, tend to disagree. The ongoing protests and riots, after all, are a reaction to the killing of George Floyd and other unarmed black citizens, which is something of which BLM wants to raise awareness. While some Black Lives Matter officials have publicly condemned the violence, others associated with BLM have defended the rioters and even participated in the destruction themselves, claiming that the riots will cause systemic change and that the benefits associated with such change will outweigh the massive cost caused by the riots. While I am of the opinion that the riots should be stopped, I will do my best to perform an objective economic analysis of the situation, considering both the benefits and the costs associated with the violence happening across the US. Let's start with the costs, and there are a lot of them. There are the obvious ones: property damage, job loss, the ruining of business owners' lives, injury, the occasional death, millions in lost sales and lost wages during an economic depression, but let's focus more on the long-term effects, which we tend not to consider as much. Let's first go to the market for goods produced by small businesses, where the left graph represents the firm and the right graph represents the market. Here we assume perfect competition, which is a good assumption because most small businesses are either perfectly competitive or monopolistically competitive, and the arguments I'm about to make are very similar to those made for the monopolistically competitive case. This is the long-run equilibrium pre-riots. As is true in the long run for competitive firms, marginal revenue demand is tangent to average total cost at its lowest point, meaning that zero economic profit is made in the long run. After the riots begin, a fixed cost is incurred, even on businesses which are not looted. Higher insurance premiums and the opportunity cost associated with living in an area where there is a high chance of losing everything to riots, covered by insurance or not, means that fixed cost rises substantially. Variable cost does not change, however, because the aforementioned costs do not vary by how much a business sells. Thus, ATC rises, but ABC does not. That means that businesses incur economic losses in the short run. However, in the short run, businesses still have an incentive to produce, since the price they receive is above ABC, meaning that they can cover variable costs as well as part of their fixed costs. If people believe that violence will be short-lived, insurance companies will lower their prices, ATC will settle back down to its original level, and the market will be as it used to be in the long run. However, if, in the long run, insurance companies and firms continue to believe that the violence poses a large threat, firms will start to exit the market. This causes the market supply curve to shift left until the equilibrium is at a point where the price meets the new ATC at its lowest point. The result is a reduction in the number of small businesses, which many times are minority owned, and an increase in price which makes living less affordable, particularly for low-wage earners. But that's not all. People will likely exit the area and move elsewhere due to all the rioting. That shifts demand left, since there are fewer customers around. This puts a downward pressure on prices that must be counteracted by yet another leftward shift of supply and the exodus of even more businesses in order that a sustainable price level is reached. At the end of the day, far fewer small businesses and far fewer black and brown owned businesses, which many times are at the epicenter of riots, will be around, and they will charge higher prices which are less affordable to consumers. And the quantity of businesses is reflected in the quantity of goods here, and it's far lower than it used to be. As stated earlier, the market will be fine in the long run if people believe that the violence is short-lived. Sadly, we are already seeing evidence that Portland believes that the violence is here to stay. Businesses, some small and some large, are exiting the city at a rate the likes of which one resident says he has never seen. While some are not too concerned that a mass exodus is happening, what is occurring now is a bad omen for what might manifest in the coming years if the danger to businesses is not contained. Many on the political left seem not to be so concerned with businesses, however, so let's transition to a topic which resonates with them a little more: workers. The graph here shows the supply and demand for labor. With fewer businesses in the area and fewer employment openings as such, demand shifts left. That means lower wages and fewer people employed as seen here. There is, however, a force that counteracts this, and that is a leftward shift in the supply of labor as workers, disillusioned by the ongoing threat to their safety, exit the area. For middle and high earners, it is perfectly conceivable that the leftward shifts of supply and demand work together to produce an equilibrium wage around that which manifested before the riots, as large numbers of both businesses and workers exit the area. For low earners, many of whom are black and brown, the story is a bit different. Low earners are, in many cases, more financially constrained than their high-earning counterparts, and thus less able to move. Thus, the leftward supply shift for low earners may not be as dramatic as that for high earners. Conversely, demand might decrease by more than for high earners because many of the businesses in the areas affected by riots hire a lot of low-wage workers and few high-wage workers. If this is so, the shifts in supply and demand conspire to give the area fewer job opportunities and lower wages. If a binding minimum wage exists, and it often does in heavily liberal cities such as Portland, the supply and demand shifts do not lower wages, but rather produce a substantial increase in unemployment as seen here. This is before, this is after the riots. There is substantial evidence of worsening worker wages and employment in riot-infested localities. Social scientists William Collins of Vanderbilt University and Robert Margo of Boston University conducted a study on the matter, and while they characterized their findings as tentative, their results show that both employment and wages for black workers, who often received low wages to begin with, were significantly lower in cities that experienced severe riots during the 1960s than in cities that did not experience severe riots. A house is, in many cases, a family's largest investment, so let's consider the market for housing. Supply here is fairly inelastic, indicated by the steep supply line because building, buying, and selling houses are complicated and time-consuming processes. After the riots, more people sell their houses and fewer buy the houses in the riot-stricken areas in order to avoid major property damage and physical harm. This constitutes a leftward shift of demand and a rightward shift of supply. Because the supply curve is so steep, the shifts in the curve have a large negative impact on housing prices, meaning that many families affected by the violence see a large decline in their net worth. Many of the families in question are black and brown families living near the poverty line who simply cannot afford to see their largest asset lose a large chunk of its value. Margo and Collins, mentioned earlier, saw a decline of 15 to 20% in the value of black-owned homes in cities with severe riots compared to those in cities with little or no unrest in the 1960s. The figure for all homes was 6 to 10%. Unfortunately, time didn't seem to remedy the problem. The 70s didn't see a great increase in housing prices and instead saw the widening of the racial wealth gap as the riots of the 60s saw a major decline in the net worth of black families. Now let's discuss business investment. Since investors and lenders have a risk when lending the money to areas that might be burned to the ground, they will charge a higher interest rate to borrowers in order to remain profitable. This means that, while demand shifts left due to the smaller number of entrepreneurs in the area in question, supply will shift left enough to make the equilibrium interest rate substantially higher than it was before. The difference between the new and old interest rates is a sort of risk premium, caused by the rioting and potential damage that comes with investment. Both the shift of supply and the shift of demand depress the quantity of money invested in riot-stricken areas and make it substantially harder for communities and local businesses to rebuild. Unfortunately, the negative economic impact on riot-stricken communities is hard to ignore. Time after time, and case after case, whether it be the 1992 Rodney King riots in LA, the Watts riots in that same city, or the 1967 Detroit riots, the situation is the same. Continual and perpetual hopelessness, joblessness, poverty, and crime. And it's not my opinion that the riots led to such conditions, it's that of many liberals and left-leaning individuals, such as Coleman Young, a Democrat and the first black mayor of Detroit, who have attributed many of the woes of a city that experiences severe riots to those riots. So what, given all of the costs involved, could be the benefits of the riots? To be sure, there aren't any obvious economic ones. Rioting ruins the economies of the affected areas. Really, the only benefit is to shock the nation, and to alert people of the problem rioters wish to fix. Some, such as University of Pennsylvania professor Daniel Gillen, believe that violent protests can do the job, citing the attention drawn to police brutality after the 1992 LA riots. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, among others, began focusing her legislative agenda on police brutality and law enforcement reform for a time. By and large, however, the reaction to the riots was one of law and order. Increased policing in hopes of squashing the riots. Anticipating this criticism, Gillen counters that today's riots are occurring across the country, and that national riots will bring national attention to today's problems, in contrast to the more local riots of the past, which drew mainly local attention to the issues the riots were about. I find that a little hard to believe, given that the last breakout of nationwide violence during the 60s resulted in the election of Richard Nixon, the quote-unquote law and order candidate, as the so-called silent majority came out to vote against the unrest. Further, after enjoying a sizable bump, the public's approval of Black Lives Matter has eroded 10 points since June according to polls. Northeastern University professor Gordana Rebrinovic echoes my sentiment, explaining that a violent movement tends to alienate potential political supporters. And then there's the question of whether the rioters' agenda is actually beneficial. While there may be some merit to doing some things they suggest, like increasing police accountability and reducing bloated police budgets, the benefits of other things BLM activists have demanded, such as abolishing the police and dismantling the nuclear family, are dubious at best. And with that, we revisit Ted Wheeler. Our analysis of the riots has concluded that they're probably not a good thing for anyone, and Mayor Wheeler knows they're not a good thing for him personally. Politically, though, they may be. His support of the protests associated with Black Lives Matter is crucial to his re-election just a few months from the making of this video. He has condemned the violence going on, but he has not taken too many measures to stop it. The question in the coming months is whether he will stand for the continual burning of a city, which poses no gain to anyone, or distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate use of police force. If the latter is true, he will do everything in his power to bring peace to Portland citizens. His decision could determine whether Portland remains the shining coastal city it has been for decades, or descends into poverty, crime, and destitution like too many other cities which have endured major lawlessness and massive destruction. Your choice, Mr. Mayor. If you liked what you saw today, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and hitting the notification bell. Once again, thanks you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.